I have been here since May of 1998, working on smart growth issues all over the state. We're a 501c3 nonprofit established officially in 2000. We split off from that original nonprofit and became our own separate nonprofit. We have 11 board members, 4 staff, and some volunteers. We don't have a very big annual budget, but we work hard and use it pretty efficiently. I think we get a lot done for the little bit we have. We work in the overlap of transportation, land use, and community. Try to figure out ways that those 3 things mesh together to create great places to live. When we talk to all of you, these are the words that come up that you think are important for us to pay attention to. And not surprisingly, they match pretty well with what we try to do. We work especially on the triple bottom line, where we have strong economies, a healthy natural environment, and happy people. Robert's going to talk to us tonight about how to work toward those outcomes using the principles in our local land use planning act. And then finally, there are 10 smart growth principles, and the first of these, I've kind of rearranged them from what you might see sometimes, are really the ones that are relevant to comprehensive planning. The second group is relevant to how we actually write the laws to organize our land use planning. And then all of these really should involve direct stakeholder collaboration. I'm going to quickly talk about why this is important. For many years, we've been building this kind of conventional suburban development. You can see it takes a lot of land. It is single use in most places. There's usually only a single way to access it, which creates a lot of driving trips. You can make it a little more compact and save some land. This is a way to build, even though they're separated single uses, at least more compactly, but it's still really dependent on car driving and still uses more land than it probably needs to. And then this is a little more compact form with more traditional neighborhood style, where you have connected grid streets so that there really are many more ways to get around, and offers lots more choices in both transportation and housing, which Robert's going to talk a little bit more about. The important thing about all of these is the cost that comes with them. So that first slide I showed you, you can see the infrastructure cost per dwelling unit approaches $80,000. Even in the more compact suburban one, it still is over 60,000. And then to get down into the 30,000 range, you really have to go to that traditional neighborhood with transit access. And really the outcome is what we're working on and what is important, much more so than the process of how to get there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, introduce Robert Liberty. Robert's been a friend of Idaho Smart Growth from the very beginning. I first met him when he was the executive director of Thousand Friends of Oregon. He's advised us off and on over the years, and I think you'll be excited, as I am tonight, to be able to learn from him, because he has a wealth of knowledge about smart growth issues. I know Robert's going to tell a little bit more about himself, but with that, I'll turn it over to Robert.
Thank you, Elaine. All right, I'm going to share my screen. And I'm getting a little bit of feedback. So if you might want to mute your speaker a little bit. Can everyone see that? Good. That is my pre-COVID haircut. I can't wait to get back to it. So this is not going to be your standard introduction to planning the Idaho Local Land Use Planning Act. You can find plenty of online introductions to the Local Land Use Planning Act. So I'm going to do something a little bit different. And my perspective is informed by 40 years of experience in protecting forest range and farmlands from rural sprawl and creating compact, livable cities with housing and transportation choices. I've been doing this, will be 40 years in September. And I've done it in a lot of places, a lot of scales. I just finished working in a town of 800 in California. And I have done it as an advocate working with citizen groups. I've worked with people in development and redevelopment, including a developer, a woman who's recreated a Chinese building in California, part of a tap room, with this very progressive then staff member from the Waco Chamber of Commerce. I've worked most recently on accessory dwelling units with Corlett Hannon on left in AARP, Keith Smith, who's a realtor in Virginia, and Katie Larcell is a Lutheran pastor here in Portland. I've worked on it with many people in rural land use, including these folks. You'll hear a little bit more about them at the end of the presentation. I've been an elected official. I've been a planning consultant. That's the right length of hair, by the way, for me. And I'm currently serving as chair of the Columbia River Gorge Commission. Two of my colleagues here, the fellow on the right is moving to Idaho in the next year or two, and he has about the same amount of experience, and he's the reason there's a national scenic area. So there's a resource coming your way. I also had the opportunity to be paid for 2 years to work on a review of all the efforts to curtail sprawl in all 50 states at the regional level and at the local level, these reports. So that is my background. And I'm currently working with a nonprofit group in Montana. So, all right, let's start with a warning. I have to tell you this. I'm not a member of the Idaho Bar. I'm not licensed to practice law in Idaho. You and Idaho Smart Growth are not my clients. Everyone clear about all that? But I am going to be presenting a description of your planning law as a law through the perspective of a lawyer. Now, why is it important to say that? What does that mean? Well, this is part of sort of your training as active and effective citizens. A law is an effort to shape or constrain behavior by words on a page. It's kind of obvious. But what that means is that the law is exactly what's on the page. It's not what people intended. It's not what you think it means. It's not a law you'd like to have. It's exactly what it says. And it does not matter if people intended something else. It's what's on the page. So when I talk about words, it's very important. Lawyers are very conscious of words because that is really what the law is and supposed to be shaping action. That's why lawyers can seem kind of fastidious about that, but that is part of my background. Okay, so it's called the Idaho Local Land Use Planning Act. Why is it local? Why is it Land Use Planning Act? Because when it was passed, 1977, there were a lot of states that were adopting state land use planning acts. And Idaho wanted it to be clear that it's local. That is by your cities and counties. Here it is in a nutshell in terms of its content. There's a purpose statement. There's a description of the makeup and the authority of planning commissions that carry out the Local Land Use Planning Act. It includes a duty to prepare a comprehensive land use plan. It lists the topics to be addressed in the comprehensive plan and the procedures for adoption. Now, not all of those are equally interesting or useful. I'm going to look at the purposes and the topics to be addressed primarily. All right. The act begins with this statement. The purpose of this act shall be to promote and I've got to move the image a little bit, the health, safety, and welfare of the people of the state of Idaho as follows. So notice it's the purpose of the act, not the purpose of the plans. To protect property rights, to ensure that adequate public facilities and services are provided at reasonable cost, to ensure the economy of the state and localities is protected, ensure that important environmental features, I'm sorry, the reason I have to do this because it's part of my screen's block, the state and localities are protected. To encourage, by the way, you note the change in wording. Went from ensure and protect to encourage. Protection of prime agricultural, forestry, and mining lands and land use for production of food, fiber, and minerals to encourage urban type development within incorporated cities. To avoid undue concentrations of population and overpopulation of land, ensure that development of land is commensurate with the physical characteristics of the land, protect life and property, areas subject to natural disasters. And then protect fish, wildlife, recreational resources to avoid this interesting undue water and air pollution. So the purpose of the act will allow a certain amount of water and air pollution, just not an undue amount, to allow local school districts to participate in planning and development to protect public airports. So those are the purposes of the act. Covers sort of generic, generally. This is a key element, and not every state has this requirement. It shall be the duty of the Planning Commission to prepare, implement, and review and update a comprehensive plan. So this is, not every state has this. You have a Planning Commission, they have to adopt a comprehensive plan, they have to review it and update it. Why is it comprehensive? If you're not familiar with this term, it's because at the time this act was passed, a lot of plans were specific to particular activities or functions of government, transportation planning, water and sewer, maybe school district. Comprehensive meant all aspects of planning, all uses of land, a broad spectrum. So that's comprehensive planning. It's now sort of standard practice to have comprehensive planning. So that's what a comprehensive plan is, what it means. Usually the plan has a lot of policy statements, some supporting documents, and then typically, and this is true in Idaho, a section on how the plan is going to be implemented. Because in Idaho, the comprehensive plan does not regulate the use of land. You can have a comprehensive plan that says, our goal is to have mixed use development and where people can walk to shops and so on. Someone comes in with a proposal to build a subdivision that has no mix of uses, no walking. You cannot deny the subdivision based on your plan, because the plan has to be translated into implementing actions like a zoning ordinance. So that's important to know. That's also not unusual in the United States. And then the act says the plan shall be based on the following components. It's a component list, not an outcome list. So this is the components. These are just the headings. It's sort of a standard list that you would find in a lot of similar statutes. Let's take a look at a few of these to look at the content. Under the land use section, that component is described as an analysis of natural land types, existing land covers and uses, and the intrinsic suitability of lands for uses such as agriculture, forestry, mineral exploration, et cetera. Okay, recreation, housing, commerce. It's an analysis. It doesn't say what it's supposed to be. It's just think about it. Housing, same thing, an analysis of housing conditions and needs, plans for improvement of housing standards, and plans for provision of safe, sanitary, and adequate housing. It does not say providing housing. It says an analysis of housing conditions and needs. Finally, natural resources. We have it again, an analysis of the uses of rivers and other waters, forests, range, soils, harbors, fisheries, etc. Agriculture, an analysis of the agricultural base of the area. So this is what's in your plan. It's thinking. It doesn't say what has to happen with those things. So this is the key point. Does the Local Land Use Planning Act require smart growth outcomes? No, it does not. It simply doesn't. It says you have to analyze things, think about things. Does it prohibit smart growth outcomes? Absolutely not. There's full discretion to achieve smart growth outcomes, but you can't rely on the statute to ensure those outcomes. Now, this is my own view. This is not something you find in an academic setting or in a law, the two types of planning, but I'm describing planning practice to you, particularly local government planning practice. One kind of planning is what I call process planning. Process planning is a description of a set of activities on a timeline resulting in the production of documents. The purpose and outcome of process planning is a document or a vision statement or chapters. It's going through and being able to say we've addressed all the topics in the statute. What it is not a description of the place that will result from the planning. It's a description of planning itself and the production of documents. This is a very different kind of planning, outcome planning. The result from this are places. Places people live, places people work, landscapes. This is the result of planning to achieve an outcome. Those are very different, and you're going to run into a lot of people, particularly local planners, who regard their job as producing documents through a process, not producing a place that we live in. What are the smart growth outcomes you want to achieve using planning? Well, you want to replace rural sprawl, the protection of rural working lands and natural resources, compact, land efficient and facilities efficient cities and towns with choices in housing and transportation to fit many people and households' needs. So these are restatements. You've probably heard these a dozen times. They're all the same thing. What's the opposite of smart growth? Why do we have to do this work? Because what we have now is sprawl. And it comes in a couple flavors. We have urban sprawl. What is urban sprawl? There's a good example. There's urban sprawl. Very low density development, homes on cul-de-sacs, intermingling of sort of remnants of productive farmlands and natural resources. And maybe not in this picture, but usually a scattering of commercial uses like a gas station or convenience store, maybe even a motel. What is rural sprawl? These, by the way, these things shade into each other across the landscape. This is rural sprawl. This is from the state of Wyoming. It's 6 miles from any town. And what you see there is a mixture of things like a subdivision. You can see with the cursor over here, another subdivision. This is a golf course gated community. Harder to see up here, but few homes up on the mountainside. Subdivision, and over here on the right is warehouses, industrial space. So it's like parts of the city were exploded out in the countryside. What is rural residential sprawl? Now, why focus on residential? Because it's by far the biggest consumer of land in the United States, urban or rural. This is rural sprawl, rural residential sprawl. This is sort of medium density rural residential sprawl. Those are probably 2, 4, 5 acre home sites in the middle of farmland. So this is a depressingly familiar part of the American landscape, now much more visible on Google Earth. You can also get, it's hard to get a good picture of it, but you can see this at 20 and 40 and 80 acre densities as well. This is produced by Dave Theobald, who's one of the few academics researching this topic in the United States. He's at Colorado State University. And this is an animated time sequence, a little hard to see, but the yellow is 1.7 acres per dwelling to 40 acres per dwelling. So it's what he calls ex-urban sprawl, I call rural sprawl. So you can just think of it as 2 to 40 acre home sites, and it is exploding across the United States. This includes a projection to 2030. Another study that I think Dave cites is between 1950 and 2000, the amount of land at urban densities, this is residential, which is the biggest share of land use in cities, that is more than 1 house per acre, increased from less than 1 to 2% of the total land area, whereas the amount of ex-urban land, which is about 1 to 40 acres per house, increased from 5% to 25%. That is a shocking statistic. So if we think of the urban and suburban densities as 0 to 1.7 acres, and don't worry about the reason it's 1.7 acres, it's conversion to metric. If we look at that 2%, that's about North Carolina. If you look at the ex-urban density, that's equal to New York, Pennsylvania, and Texas. So this is a gigantic now part of the American landscape. What's the problem with it? Is it a problem? Well, here's some of the consequences, and Elaine in introduction alluded to these. When you spread out people at very low densities over the landscape, it's very expensive to provide them with services. Roads are one of the biggest expenses in road maintenance. If you're building a road to serve 10 homes instead of 200 homes, the cost per person is much higher. Same with police protection, rural fire service, and school transport. It's one of the big items in rural school districts' budgets is transportation of kids. And if there's just a few for every mile, it's much more expensive. Here's another probably better known consequence of rural sprawl is the destruction of farm and forest land and replacement with low density development. This is in Montana in the Gallatin Valley, so the area around Bozeman, lost half of its irrigated land in 25 years. Not just subdivision, but also single home sites. Another consequence is water pollution. This is Fish Creek in Teton County, Wyoming, and a beautiful creek, pretty like an emblem of the West, the Rocky Mountain West. But what you'll find along that creek now is signs like this. Bacterial levels in these waters at times exceed recommended Department of Environmental Quality standards. Why? Because it's been contaminated with human sewage from septic tanks. Even though all those septic permits went through a review process to determine the land was suitable for septic sewage disposal, but there's too many of them. Sometimes the permits are authorized incorrectly. And so the consequence is you're not supposed to swim or float in these waters. Here's an example of water consumption. So in Montana, each domestic well is used 76 gallons per day per person. At 2.2 people, so 1,000 new wells for 1,000 new homes would be 157,000 gallons per day, or 57 million gallons per year. It's a lot of water. And of course, homes in the countryside cause fires, and the fires then put lives and property at risk. Firefighting resources are diverted to protecting lives and property while the woods burn. So this is another consequence of rural residential sprawl, and then destruction, displacement of wildlife. Now, one of the things I've observed in the Northwest is it's not only destruction, displacement, it's the domestication of wildlife. So there are now elk herds that come down and live in towns and feed on the backyards because they're safe from predators and because their range is being destroyed. It's not wildlife when it spends the winters in town. All right, can planning help smart growth triumph over sprawl? Yes, but not this way. Now I'm going to give an example of planning that fails. That's process planning, not a good outcome. So we're going to use this hypothetical actual town, city and county, Acme, Idaho. All right, here's the vision statement for Acme. I think adopted relatively recently. Acme is a family-friendly community respectful of faces new and old that values a high quality of life, inclusivity, economic vitality, outdoor recreation, and the preservation of the surrounding ecosystem. Acme is committed to creating a vibrant downtown and lively neighborhoods that are well connected to the city center and one another. I imagine the committee worked on that for a couple of months. What impact does it have on the development of Acme? Any guesses? Scott Oliver, I can see, is, even though muted, is shaking his head, and 0. That is correct. Let's give that man a gold star if we can do that on the software. 0, it has 0 effect. It is meaningless in itself. It could be helpful, but in itself, it has no significance. This is Acme, Idaho. And one of the things you can see is that there's been a lot of sprawl around a very low density residential development at quite a distance. This is the city center of Acme. Would you say there's room for infill and redevelopment? This is the city boundary. The growth management area is shown as coterminous with the area of city impact, which is an area over which cities have some authority with counties. So one of the things, it's a little hard to see the city boundary. You can see the city boundary now includes very large areas of land that are, well, they're in farm production. And that outside the city limits, this is actually a golf course development, is outside the city limits. And this area here is more this low density residential sprawl. So what would be the strategy for this town? Well, it turns out the town is interested in expanding, is annexing more land for a larger area for development. Here are the land use designations. So what's a land use designation? On a comprehensive plan, because it's not a regulation itself, says here's the general types of development more conservation we expect, and those are land use designations. And then the zoning will be implemented to carry out those designations. Well, here's a kind of standard. You'll notice I'm disguising some elements of ACME. So if you look, you'll see transitional and edge neighborhoods in the legend there over here. And that's a big part of what's around the town. You also notice that this area of downtown core, if you remember that image, the actual downtown core is this big. So if you have this at the edge, here's one of the questions. This is in the influence area, but it's not actually part of the town, and it's not proposed for annexation. So we have urban type of development outside the city and no plan to include it. And then here's one of the designations you saw on the map, edge neighborhoods. Edge neighborhoods consist of single-family neighborhoods that bridge the transition from city to surrounding agriculture and open space. This is a very common widespread concept in planning in the United States. What does that mean? Bridge the transition from city to surrounding agriculture and open space. Well, Acme County, actually what it is low density residential development. And outside the city, you now find Acme County's zoning ordinance, which has an agricultural zone of 20 acre minimum lot size, meaning the land can be cut into 20 acre pieces with homes on it, or 2.5 acres, which is called an agricultural rural residential 2.5 acre minimum lot size. So let's think about where we are in Acme. Acme has a very tiny downtown, almost nothing there with a lot of empty space around it. But the downtown core area has this big land designation. Then it has zones in the city, which are a mixture of low density housing and supposed agriculture. Then outside Acme is 2.5 acre zoning and 20 acre minimum lot size. Pretty hard to tell what is city and what is country. And this is particularly problematic. So here are two things I like. I like hamburgers and I like sundaes. Two good things, very different. So if we think of the hamburger as agriculture and the ice cream sundae as residential, this is what that zone does. You put in the agriculture and you put in the residential and you grind them up. And this is what you get. That is low density residential agriculture zone. It's glop. No one wants to eat that. So this is a fundamental point here, one of a couple I'm going to make. Agriculture and low density residential development are incompatible uses, not complementary uses. They don't transition one into the other. Low density residential transitions into agriculture the same way that a jackrabbit transitions into a wolf as a wolf consumes it. It destroys it. And yet we think that there's this transition. That's a very different idea than the idea there's city and there's country. So that's a bad example from Acme. Are there some examples of success in smart growth? Yes, I'm going to show you some. This is Frankenmuth, Michigan, population 5,600. I've been to Frankenmuth twice. You can see there's a very clear delineation of the town and the countryside. This is a close-up. City, country. Not a transition, a distinction. Winters, California. By the way, there's no smart growth planning requirements in Michigan. They did that on their own. Winters, California, population 7,200. I've been to Winters. It's in the Central Valley. City, country. Sharp, distinct. Again, no state mandate to do this. The city and the county and the voters chose to do this. Corvallis. Now this is a state with mandated smart growth. So you can see Corvallis here. There's the city, there's the edge. We're going to take a look over time though. This is Corvallis in 1994. So now it's about 25 years from the picture I'm going to use next. And I'm going to identify some areas. Pick one, any one of them, look at it very carefully. This is 1994, population 46,701. 2018, 24 years later, the population's gone up 20%. Notice the edge. Is this perfect? No, we got some kind of growth and sprawl over here. But in these places, for example, you can see that 20% growth, the edge has remained clear and distinct. That's infill, that's redevelopment. Now, another state that, or a state not normally associated with planning leadership, but Sioux Falls, South Dakota has actually done a remarkable job over many decades now. Once again, there's the city, a little harder to see because of the colors, but there's the edge, really sharp. And they've been at this for 30 or 40 years. And not surprisingly, in all these places, having a clear distinction in the city and the country and using land wisely inside the city limits is associated with infill and redevelopment. And you can see a lot of new buildings in downtown Sioux Falls. And I don't know if Sioux Falls downtown has had the kind of renaissance that Boise's had, but you can see it's pretty impressive. And that is characteristic. These things are never done in isolation. The idea of sharp separation of city and country is associated with also building up vitality in the downtown. This is Winters, California, a small place, of course. And then this is an illustration of Portland of a major infill and redevelopment on just 70 acres that's now home to, I don't know, 10 or 20,000 people. This is a map that I had prepared many years ago. Those dots represent 100,000 housing units, 100,000. The brick colored line or reddish brown line, sienna colored line is the urban growth boundary. And the dark blue is apartments, multifamily, and the aqua is single family residential. So one of the things that you see actually is that there isn't a particular pattern. The apartments are everywhere and all the suburbs distributed not perfectly evenly, but pretty evenly. And if you look at these edges, there is certainly some single family residential development, but it's scattered also throughout the entire area. So this is a compact growth infill redevelopment strategy that's carried out. So what is the formula? Well, this is a shorthand, obviously, but here are the ingredients. So these are things you can do in Idaho, nothing's stopping you from doing this. Plan and stage extensions of urban services concurrently with annexations based on compact growth. Don't let services and annexations dictate growth patterns. Don't annex or extend roads and sewers and then allow the development to occur. Plan it. Reinvest in existing neighborhoods before investing in new ones. By the way, politically popular. Invest in what we have before investing on things for the new people. Fix it first policy. Very simple, also very popular. Maintain what you have, roads, public facilities like schools and so on first. Don't spend money on new things if you can't maintain the things you already have. And then this is, I think a number of you know about this. This is particularly challenging. Transportation planning goes on separately. It has a set of its own laws, and it's often treated as an independent activity. Roads, highways are the armature of development. If you have the skeleton, you're going to get the development. So it's very important that transportation planning and projects are a way of executing a growth plan, not the structure for it. And this is rare in the United States. Typically, the transportation plan goes on independently, determines land use outcomes. I'm going to give an example from Sioux Falls, which has been at this a long time, and don't worry about the specifics, it's more illustration. This is what they do in Sioux Falls and have done for decades. See these tiers on the right? Annexation advised within 5 years, and then they have a capital improvement plan, and then the development occurs in the traditional neighborhood way. So these series of tiers, and everyone's plan, everyone knows about it's built into the budgeting. This is what you do when you have a compact growth plan, which is staged and related to your budgeting, public facilities and services. And they've done it, and you can see the results. Here are two other elements for compact city growth. Rethink parking requirements for housing and commercial uses. If you count driveways and all the roads, we have more land for cars than we do for people in houses in the United States. It's incredible, and it's because of all these parking requirements. We care more about housing a car than people. And then we've used zoning to separate people by income and therefore by race and class, a major issue in planning. In fact, I'm speaking about that tomorrow morning. So let's, I'm gonna have a little digression about housing density and compact growth, because this will illustrate the point about efficiency. Here's some rural residential acreage home sites. They could be anywhere in the Mountain West. And I picked them because these 3 homes together are on 60 acres, a little less. So about 20 acres per house. Keep that in mind, 20 acres per house. This is the same 58 point, in this case, 39 acres on downtown Boise. And you can see the Capitol in the upper right. So I don't know, 40% of downtown Boise could be built on those 3 lots. On one of those lots, you could build this standard subdivision. So instead of 1 home, you could have 99 homes on what was 1 lot. This is called cottage cluster housing. I'm sure there's some of it now in Idaho. So you have a common area, people own these small homes separately, a lot of greenery between them. So these are 15 units per acre. So on that 1 lot, you could have 300 homes. This is an old standard, it's called the sort of mixture of cottages and duplexes that are rental units. They're 33 per acre. So in that 120 acre lot, you could have 660 homes. And finally, this is a kind of fancy architect designed apartment building. Its density is 42 dwelling units per acre. Notice it's 2.5 stories or 2 stories in a cupola. You could have 840 rental units on 120 acre lot. So that is a gigantic range from 1 to 800 units. That's how we're using land. And in the city, even at these moderate scales and heights, you can be much more efficient. So what is the formula for stopping rural sprawl? You have to protect the lands outside the city from rural sprawl with rural zoning, protect working lands and natural resources to keep people and property out of harm's way. You need to, just like in the city, you want to extend services and facilities along with annexation to allow compact growth. You don't provide those services in the rural areas. You don't provide the roads, emergency service, school transportation. So that's not what it's for. And then it's helpful if there are some supplementary public and private conservation easement programs, particularly in areas where there's a fair amount of hostility regulation, which is, I think, the entire United States. All right, let's talk about this a little bit because this is pretty challenging. The first thing you have to keep in mind is that we have a problem. People have taken city zoning concepts and applied them to rural working lands and natural resources, and they simply do not fit. And they're so deeply embedded that people revert to them instantly all the time. And so I'm pounding this point home because I really would like you to wean yourself from these thoughts. The first is that farm, ranch, and forest lands and wildlife habitat and natural resources, they're in fully productive use. They're not undeveloped. They're not vacant. They're not awaiting their destiny to be divided into home sites and higher and best use. They are already in full productive use as they are. They're not vacant, undeveloped. Second, lot size. This is the most pernicious idea. Lot size refers to building houses on properties, and this is applied across the landscape so that all working lands and natural resources should not be, but are treated like they're suburban, future suburban developments. When you say lot size, that's what you're talking about, a lot with a house on it. That is not what working lands are for. They're not there to be built into lots. Okay, and the first thing people do with regulation is to talk about lot size. It's taking a city concept, putting it in the countryside, and that starts you off on the wrong foot. Then this density terms. So if you talked about homes on half-acre or 1 acre lots in the city, that is very low density. Actually, you can't really do that in Oregon cities. You have to buy multiple lots if you want to have a lot that big. But if you take that and put that in countryside, it's extremely high density. So I've seen this in Montana. We have this phrase, very low density residential, but they've applied it outside the city limit and it's 1 or 2 homes per acre. That's extremely high for rural. very low for city. So those are things you want to avoid. Here's a menu of things that can be done to protect working lands and natural resources in the rural areas. I'm mostly going to talk about the first one. Okay, this is in your statute. Each governing body shall establish within its jurisdiction one or more zones or zoning districts where appropriate, and these zoning districts shall be in accordance with the policy set forth in the adopted comprehensive plan. Very logical, okay? So the plan doesn't shape anything. It's a statement of a vision or a policy and general designations. And this is what you turn that into reality with the regulation of the use of lands. So if you're going to have a zoning district for agriculture, you have to understand what agriculture is. Okay, this is my definition, but they're all alike. It's the production of crops and livestock and non-food crops such as nursery stock carried out as a business or livelihood. This is what it's not. It's a productive industry like making computers. You're making wheat or cattle or whatever. It's a business, it's an industry. It's not a lifestyle. It's not a cultural heritage. It's not a landscape, an amenity or natural resource or a hobby. When you talk about it that way, all of a sudden it turns into places that you want to put houses on. It's a lifestyle amenity. In fact, that's how these ranchettes are sold. You know, ranchettes or lifestyles. That is the wrong way to think of it. This is another problem. This is how Americans think of farming and ranching. You have one block, 160 acres. There's a house, a farmhouse, a rancher or farmer, and a barn or crops. That hasn't been true for over a century. That's just not the scale. That's not how they're organized. You'll see in the statistics for Idaho. This is from the Census of Agriculture for Idaho, and I'm going to ignore that note at the bottom for a moment. So there's supposedly about 25,000 farms in Idaho. The average size is 468 acres. The average sales per farm is $302,476, and the net farm income is a little over $52,000. Now, what is the relationship between those last two numbers? Well, farming is a volume activity. It's like if you go to a convenience store like 7-Eleven, a typical 7-Eleven has $1 million in gross sales, $1 million a year. Does that make the owner a millionaire? No. And a typical return on a convenience store is 5%. Grocery stores are actually lower, I think, than that. So it means if you have $1 million of sales, there's $50,000 of profit. So in the average farm in Idaho, out of $302,000, about 1/6 of that comes back as net cash return. This is a description of a business. That's why 2.5 acre lots and 20 acre lots are just insane. They have nothing to do with agriculture. Now you'll note, now I'm going to talk about the note. This census, which is done every 5 years, has a definition of farms because that's what they do the census on, farms. What is a farm? It's anything that can or has earned $1,000 in a year. What does it take to earn $1,000? Well, at the Billings livestock market, it's one cow. So this data includes a whole bunch of things that are clearly not really businesses. So here's an overview again of family farms. 96% of family farms. You may know about some, or Ida is a corporate farm, but almost all the farms are family owned and they are family corporation owned, but they're not some big multinational. The average production expenses are $266,000. Their equipment costs $176,000. Okay, this is a business, right? It's not a big business. This is a family business. That's the scale of it. But 60% of the farms in the census are under $10,000 in sales, which means the net return is virtually nothing. So this data is all skewed to make the farms smaller. Only 40% earn over $10,000. What's the point of all this? The point is 40 acres, 160 acres with a house on it has nothing to do with agriculture. It's a business, and your zoning needs to reflect that. So where do you apply this zoning? Well, you apply it to land that's used for farming or ranching or capable, and not just the part that's prime. Most farmland in the United States is not prime. And prime, by the way, refers to sort of its ability to be cultivated, not necessarily what it can produce. So here's an example from where I've been working in Montana. This is the extraterritorial jurisdiction, the same thing in Idaho, around the town of city of Livingston. The map on the left from their growth policy update shows current use, and it shows the dark brown is lands in crop production and the shaded is lands in pasture. This is the same area shown using the Montana Cadastral Survey, land classification used for taxation and other purposes. So the gold is cropland and the red is pasture land, this classification. And then once again, this is an area of soils. You'd use all of those things to do your mapping, but you certainly don't develop an agricultural zone on little pieces of it. It's got to be a big block so that farmers can operate. And that relates to land division standards. So these are not lots for houses. Sorry, you can tell this drives me crazy because I've been working on it for years. What you have as a parcel for agriculture is something you can farm efficiently. If you look at the pivot irrigation circles over here on the left, those come in different sizes. Typically they're 163.20. I think there's some that are 640. So you can't put one of those on a 40-acre piece. You can't use that. So that wouldn't work. Here's cattle grazing. All right, if you have cattle, you move them around to different pastures and you have to put them in a truck. You don't put them in a truck and drive 20 miles to go to a 20-acre parcel. It's much more efficient to have them together. And over here is grain production, probably wheat. Those combines, when they turn a corner at the edge, some of that land isn't cultivated. You're not going to move your equipment onto a 20-acre parcel with a big combine that costs $150,000. So you've got to keep the parcels big enough they can be used. And by the way, every time the parcel gets smaller, price per acre goes up. Why is that? Smaller parcels, people are buying them to put houses on. Bigger parcels, it's a much smaller market. So does that mean there shouldn't be any small parcels? No, but there's already lots of small parcels. It's the big parcels you have to protect. That's what the land division standards are. It allows farming, ranching, related activities and buildings as of right. You don't have to go through a permit process. You can just do it. And also supplementing income. Farming is a hard business. A lot of years you don't make money. So if you want to sell a permit to people to go fishing on your property or go hunting, or maybe have a farm stand, that's all fine. Farmers, like the rest of us, often need 2 incomes in their household to make a living. These are the things you don't allow. No subdivisions, no stars, no offices or industrial development, not allowed. That just is nothing to do with agriculture, and that includes federal offices. It drives me crazy when I see them in rural lands. What about houses? Well, this is the toughest thing. The fact is, there are more houses in ag areas by far than there are people farming. Many farmers and ranchers own multiple houses because agriculture's changed. They're using equipment that's more efficient. They've bought up 5 farms with 5 homes. They rent them out. They don't need them. So you've got to be very strict on allowing, if you allow more homes, you're doing it for a political reason or a fairness reason, not because it's needed for agriculture. And this is a lesson we knew we'd have to learn in Oregon. We did. No one starts the business of farming by spending money on their house. Hewlett-Packard started in a garage. They didn't take their money and build a house in a garage in order to have the business. They had it there. So anyone who says, I need to build a house to start farming is not in the farming business, they're in the housing business. Very important, because people want to say, well, we need houses for farming. There's plenty of houses for farming. And a lot of farmers want to get rid of them or don't want to manage them. So I'm generalizing a bit, but that's just very important to understand. Okay. Now I've talked about the laws, the formulas, the techniques. How does this actually get done? How do you get from these ideas and principles through zoning to actually accomplish something? Who does it? You. This is the punchline. Otherwise, you're going to have process planning. So you have to do it. Now, I have met a number of people who have been remarkable in their impact in Oregon. I want to show you what one person can do. This woman's name is Miki Blizzard. She described herself as a middle-aged hippie living in a rural area outside Portland. And over here on the left, you see this red line. The blue line, actually this gray map, is called the Portland-Vancouver Metropolitan Transportation System Plan from 1960. And it was a plan for a huge network of freeways. And that plan in 1960, the blue things were built. That plan was implemented. And so after 30 years, a bunch of leaders said, well, this next segment, we have to complete this circle. We'll just die of angst if we don't have a complete ring here. I mean, it's unnatural not to build ring roads. So this is the next segment. And the red segment. And that's the area where Miki and a lot of other people live in the countryside. And it's a story I won't go into today, but we brought a lawsuit, and the lawsuit said, oh, wait a minute, you can't build that stuff in the countryside. But we knew it was going to get built. And Miki said to me, I just met her, she said, Robert, we need to offer an alternative. I said, Miki, transportation plans for freeways cost hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars. They're incredibly complicated. They involve this modeling work and stuff. We're going to come up with we can't do that. We can stop this and then work for something better. I said, that's not good enough. We have to offer something to people. She was right. And it did cost several $100,000 to develop the alternative you see on the right. And that alternative was recognize the reason people drive is because the way we've distributed stuff over the landscape. They have to use freeways because everything's spread out and there's a bunch of other elements to it. Roads don't connect. We don't have enough transit investment. So this alternative on the right was developed, which was more efficient, less congestion, less air pollution, and it was adopted. That freeway does not exist because of Miki Blizzard. And that became the basis for scenario planning, integrated scenario planning around land use and transportation in the United States and other parts of the world. No training and planning. This is Roy Hearn. I'm sad to say this is an obituary photo. Roy was a rancher, small scale rancher, but a commercial rancher in Baker County, which borders Idaho across the Snake River. And Roy never went to college. I never asked him if he finished high school. It's possible he didn't. And Roy decided he really didn't want houses being built on the ranch land because it interfered with his operation, because I think he had an objection to seeing that happen. Roy taught himself the local land use plan and regulations and started intervening as an individual citizen. He was so good that when I went out there to meet with some other activists and did a training, Roy, in the middle of a presentation on a very technical legal point, which, by the way, I did a lot of training for individuals on these details, Roy corrected me. And the people in the room, a lot of whom were college educated and kind of fancy, kind of looked at Roy and then looked at me to see if I was going to blow up. So, well, tell me, Roy. So off the top of his head, he goes through and describes what the requirements are for this kind of hearing. I said, thank you, Roy. I'm sorry, everyone ignore what I said. He's correct. Roy won a bunch of those challenges on his own, just as a self-taught expert, and therefore protected the ranch land in Baker County. The man on the right is Cliff Lamb, a really wonderful man, also now deceased. He owned 450 acres in Lane County, which has off and on been one of the top softwood producing counties in the United States. He cared a lot about forestry and forest land. He taught me a lot about forest land management economics. And he started, he was my client and provided advice, and another long story, multiple years. Finally, the case of Lamb via Lane County went to the Oregon Supreme Court. And in large part because of Cliff's work, 8.7 million acres of private forest land in Oregon is not being chopped up for housing. This is a father and son, Jason and David Lett. And on the left is their vineyard, Irie Vineyard. David graduated from UC Davis in the enological or viticulture program, came to Oregon in the early 1970s and bought an old prune orchard. The prune orchard was on south-facing slope with a soil called a lateritic soil, which is definitely not prime, considered kind of a trash soil. And the county commissioners had zoned this, like Acme County, for 2.5 and 5 acre home sites. David started growing Pinot Noir grapes, and within 7 years in blind tasting in Paris, his wines had come in second and third. And he built the wine industry in the Willamette Valley. It's really from this one man, and that's his son. And couple things about this is he proved that this land that people thought was worthless had great value as part of a very important Oregon industry. And he was a ferocious advocate for land use planning and land regulation until his death. His son and wife were carrying on with the winery, always remained active in land use. Gary Harris is a grass or a seed grower, I should say, in the high desert plateau. It's a little bit like the Snake Valley, but higher. You can see it on his property there on the left. And he is very successful as a seed grower of carrot seeds, onion seed, and grass seed. Extremely high production per acre, kind of shocking. He told us, I mean, I never would have known. Very successful. And what he did not want was destination resorts. And everyone said this land is worthless, it's scrubland, it's sagebrush, has no value. And he said, the hell it is. I make my living off of it. We need to protect this land. We don't need more resorts. So on the right is a celebration of a multi-year victory over proponents of resort, including, by the way, the governor of the state of Oregon, who wanted this resort. And that land in the background has now been protected for agriculture. And that's because of Gary and the allies like him. Finally, Marguerite Watkins. Marguerite Watkins was active in the Coeur League of Women Voters. That's the Southern Oregon coast. Coos County was a very timber-dependent county. It's now a very red county politically. And Marguerite was like a lot of League women committed to making the planning program work. And she took on some pretty tough causes. One of them was the right to participate in land use proceedings and to appeal local government decisions. And I represented her in a case that established that requirement, although not brilliant lawyering. I thought it was obvious from the beginning. Marguerite was relentless. She was cared about coastal resources, citizen participation, forest land. And I got a call from her husband one day, and he said, Robert, you know, Reed, he called her, is sick. She has emphysema, and can you come see her because she's dying? He'd been a chain smoker. So I went to visit them in a very modest home in Coos Bay, and Marguerite was a very practical and kind of low affect woman, really short of emotion, but she was relentless. So at the very end, I was going to leave, and I knew I'd never see her again. So I gave her a pin, and Howard and I cried. It's a very emotional moment. Marguerite, I think, got a little misty-eyed. And so I stood to leave, knowing I'd never see her again. And she said, just a minute, Robert, I've got something for you. And she reached under the couch where she was lying with oxygen mask and said, she had 4 manila folders, said, Robert, there's 4 land use proceedings. I'm not going to finish them. I'd like you to take them up and let's review them now. These are the people that made our system work. They weren't trained in this. They weren't specialists. They had passion and they had commitment. So this is why you are critical, because the kind of place you want Idaho to be is going to be determined by what you do and how you act on your commitment to keeping Idaho lovable and livable. And that's why it's an honor to address you. I'll be glad to answer questions.
Thank you, Robert. That was wonderful. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, you got it. You unshared your screen. So if anyone has a question, I know that even from me personally, that was like so good and so deep, so much information. So I would not be surprised. I'm sort of blathering on to give people an opportunity to sort of chew on what they just heard. But please feel free if you are okay to turn your video on and ask your question, please feel free to do that, or you can type it in the chat. I'll pause for a moment and see if anyone wants to jump in.
I'd like to jump in.
Perfect. Go ahead, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Robert. I'm Wendy Green, Planning and Zoning Administrator in Adams County, very rural. And I have a pretty new Planning and Zoning Commission. I'm a very inexperienced Planning and Zoning Administrator. We're trying to rewrite our comp plan and zoning ordinances. And of course, we've been doing just what you said. We've been thinking about parcel sizes as an attempt to protect ag land. If we don't want to think in terms of parcel sizes, how do we protect that ag land? So if I'm a landowner and I own 1,200 acres in rural Adams County, I want to sell half of it because I can't manage it anymore. How does the county manage that? What do we allow? Can we allow people to divide their land, sell part of it, but just not issue building permits? What do we do if we're not thinking in terms of parcel sizes?
That's great, Wendy. So one of the things I drew a kind of artificial distinction between a lot size, which you think of as residential, and a land division standard. So you're actually asking, this is a great question because it's one people struggle with. First of all, so I'm going to take some bits of this. People say, well, I'm having trouble with farming. I want to sell off part of it. Okay, but why wouldn't we allow that to anyone who owns a business? If Elaine is having difficulty making a living as a city councilor, why shouldn't she be able to sell off part of her property and have something else built there? Right, so that's it's not something everyone can do. And there's an assumption that you're allowed to do that. If you're constantly selling off pieces of your property to stay in farming, you're not going to be in farming very long. And it is a tough business, but there are people quite good at it. So I think this idea that, well, to stay in business, I have to sell part of my foundation of the business is problematic. So what I'd say is the parcel size divisions is you'd want to have an analysis of what are the pieces that if you, so this is going to be a little bit technical, Wendy, but then I'm going to go back and talk about the political issue. If it's farming or ranching, what is the smallest piece that someone would buy to operate if it's not contiguous? Because that's how this happens. Farmers and ranchers may own separate pieces, or is there something nearby? So maybe that's pretty large. Maybe that's a section, 640 acres. Maybe it's a little smaller, 320 acres. You have to look at what parcel sizes there are already. If the question is, well, I want to be able to sell up pieces because this is, my retirement. That's just a straight on question, which is how many houses are we going to allow in the countryside so people can make money off of it? And that's not just because they're greedy. That's, it's part of thinking and planning. But then you're addressing the question directly, which is, what do we think is fair for individuals to be able to do to make money by dividing off pieces and putting homes on it? Just take that on directly. And how much of that can we have? Because at some point, you don't have any country for people to live in or make a living off because it's all divided up. So this is a typical planning question is what's the maximum amount we could do with something and retain the integrity and value of it? So what I would say is you want to have a land division standard. Then if you're going to allow houses, you're going to say, why are we allowing them? Because we think it's fair, because people are entitled to make some money off their land, or we're going to apply that in the city. When you get to that point, then you'd say, well, let's put the houses, now I'm going to have to get technical again. Let's put the houses together in one place. Let's not spread them out. It'd be easier to serve, lower impact. So if we're going to say, as a matter of fairness, if you own 1,200 acres, you can have 3 house lots. We're going to put them next to the road, next to each other, okay? And they're going to be 5 acres. Except that you are doing damage to the countryside. That's my view. You're hurting it, right? But you're going to limit it. And then the other thing you'd say is, we know that those 5-acre lots will sell for, I don't know what, $200,000 now. So you're getting $1 million if there's 5 lots, $1 million worth from something that wasn't worth much. That's great. Now, in exchange, we'd like a conservation easement on the remainder of the land. And going forward, people's expectations need to change. It's the other thing. If people's expectation is always, you can keep doing this forever, then ultimately, of course, it looks like Acme County. So there has to be an intervention to say, actually, we think this land has a lot of value other than for home sites. And that's the primary value. So we're going to allow a certain amount of homes to be built. There are going to be consequences of that. They're not all good, but it's going to provide stability in the long term. So after everyone's gotten their little bit of subdivision development, then everyone knows whether they're going to buy it as no more of that. It's just like a lot in town. It's going to be what it is. Now, there are some techniques that you can use that are complicated and hard. One is transferable development rights, way too complicated to go into now. It's usually overpromised, it's just complicated to do, but it can be done. And I actually described this, how it might work in Idaho many years ago for Idaho Smart Growth. So Wendy, is that helpful, or are you still mystified with a lot of question marks coming out of the top of your head?
Both. Yes, it was helpful. And yes, I'm still mystified
Okay.
Trying to sell this to my county commissioners.
You know, I think this is the other thing you're saying is how to sell it. And the politics. There's a lot more sophistication that goes into the planning techniques than there is in the communication and the politics. A lot of people are really good on planning policy. They don't know how to get it done politically. That is a craft and a skill that's equal to any of the planning techniques. So this is the folks in Montana have to deal with this that we're working with. So one thing is an educational background about what this land is and what it is for. And then I think something that's never really done, well, almost never done, is this frank discussion about what are people entitled to do with their land in the countryside? Is it all going to be subdivisions? And are we going to allow that to go on forever? Or are we doing this because we feel that Rancher Bill has had this property, his family for 100 years, and he doesn't have kids and he has no retirement? Okay, the answer to that is not hell with Rancher Bill. I don't think that's the answer. But we're not talking about dividing up the land like it's going to protect anything. We're talking about, okay, we're going to do this once because we think it's fair, and then that's done. So I think one of the things to do is actually be much more frank about it. What is disastrous is to say that 20 acres with homes on it is agriculture. That's a disaster. So don't do that. And take on home building for what it is, which is a question of fairness or enrichment or whatever, and say, if we apply that principle to everybody, what is the community like? So that might be helpful. Maybe one question mark got erased, Wendy.
That was great. We have 3 wonderful hands queued up. So it looks like we had Jim, then Rachel, then Cameron. So Jim, go ahead.
Well, I'll try and keep it short. So you're familiar with Ada County and the fact that a lot of what ought to have been done should have been done a generation ago. When you were talking about the capital improvements plan, when we had an impact fee law that allowed us to do capital improvements plan and start planning out what infrastructure we needed. Because Ada County has a separate highway district, we said, hey, this is where we're going to build the arterials. So cities, mostly Meridian, CUNA, Eagle, when you get around to it, this is where the arterials are going to be. And then we'll build them out to 3, 5, maybe even 7 lanes. So we are already telegraphing to these farmers, these landowners, this is where development's going to happen. And guess what? That's where development happened. And now we can't afford to maintain it. So, and there's just like patches of farmland. I mean, we need to figure out a way of doing an intervention over in Canyon County so they don't do the same thing. But my question is, so what do we do now? Because now we have this low density sprawl all over the western side of the county that is bankrupting us. And if we do actually implement this capital improvements plan to put in the roads, and the cities can't afford to even provide transit to those areas because they're not dense and they're barely able to provide other services, the same other city services. So, and it's developed just as exactly as you described, you know, there's low density housing over here, and then you get in your car and you go to the school, or you get in your car and go to the park, or you get in your car, and so you generate a tremendous number of trips, car trips out of that. So are you saying we're kind of a lost cause, or is there some other thing? What I want to hear maybe is there's some strategy. I know there's sort of this school of sprawl retrofits, but that seems awfully hard. Or if there's some sort of economic approach, you say, hey, listen, taxpayers, these properties generate enough money to pay for the services they need, and these don't. So you need to come up with another way to fill in the gap for the luxury of living in those areas where you have low density. I don't know. What are the solutions to do?
There's it's hard. I'm going to turn on my light here just a moment. It's not a good metaphor when your presenter is in the dark, right? Especially when you get a question like this. What I would say is, what I would say is, you know, part of this is, okay, the eggs have scrambled. What do we do? I think that is partly a site-specific response. in an area of high growth and high value, there's opportunities for infill and redevelopment. Now, not everyone wants that, so that's a problem. And then other areas, I think it's stop the bleeding, like don't densify anymore, you know, at this transition stage, right? Just stop doing the bad stuff. And then pick a few areas and you're going to have to do the redevelopment. Now, when the home values are high, that doesn't happen. It's one of the reasons why this, instead of the Duane transect, which for those of you who know about him, it drives me crazy. It's just a description of sprawl. You know, when Acme County, let's say Acme County turned the corner and became growing compactly, it gets to 5-acre home sites with big homes on it. What is it really? What's going to happen with that? It's very difficult to retrofit unless the homes are very low value. So I would say that there would be areas where you would have an infill strategy, and maybe it takes a long time. The second thing is a taxpayer impact statement. And that can be applied both to services or facilities or to big infrastructure planning. And if nothing else, you can start to adjust the fees and charges. For affluent people, this is not going to be an inhibition, right? They can pay for it. But for other people, it is going to be significant. And I think you can say this is fair. Now, I don't, people want to say make development pay its way. I didn't pay for the infrastructure around this house. You know, people that aren't even alive today did. So I don't think you can be a purist about that. But for operating costs, I think it's fair to say, and for future costs, look, this is a lot more expensive. And so it's going to have to cost a lot more. And it can be on the sprawl developers to say, you want to build a low density, that's great. Your impact fees are higher, quite a bit higher per house. So I think that can help. The scrambled eggs thing is just, Jim, it's really tough. And the basic principle would be for some of that is, again, if there's no way that it's going to have better, you know, more efficient use of the land, it's to just freeze it. You know, don't go from 10-acre lots to 5-acre lots or 5-acre to 3, right? And then make these charges and separate out parts of it where you have to do the infill. I'd also say that the Ada County Transportation District, like the state of Idaho itself, is, I don't think Oregon's any better actually, but they are a very big part of the problem. And they build very expensive facilities that actually, talking about a term that most environmental groups hate, cost benefit return. It's like benefiting a small number of commuters who live a far distance away with very expensive improvements. That's something else that, you know, stop. You talked about intervention for, I forget which one of the adjoining counties. I think that's exactly what is needed. At least don't let them go down the same path. Sarah, who's next?
Rachel, go for it.
Hi there. I think my question was very similar to Jim's, but specifically one of the points that you brought up when you're talking about what land use agencies could do to prevent this type of issue, I found really interesting. And I was just hoping you could expand a little bit more on, it was instead of letting development drive growth, what land use agencies could do to take charge of that. And I think that's definitely something that is really prevalent in Ada County right now. And I'm just hoping you could, like, do you recommend any resources for policies that you think are effective? Is there something I should read? Like, what, like, how can this be more prevalent in our area?
I think one thing is I give these examples specifically because you can look at what they did. And it's the stuff that relates to fiscal analysis and unscrambling eggs, that's pretty complicated. But infill redevelopment, compact growth is not complicated. And the primary tool for that is zoning. And you have to mean it, stick with it, not have a bunch of variances. Okay. And you have to deal with the politics, like higher density housing upsets people. Although once, you know, one of the things I've observed is no matter what the density is at starting point, when it increases, some people object. So after 9/11, there was proposal about a bunch of redevelopment proposals in Lower Manhattan. People there were objecting to the increased density, right?
Laughable.
Anything. So you're never going to, it's not like there's some level at which people are comfortable. They move into a place and then it changes. So I would say you can look at places that have done this right. Look at the zoning as the first thing. Looking at infrastructure planning is the second thing. But the thing that you should also look at is, how did this get done politically?
Mhm.
Who are the messages? So tomorrow I'm giving this talk on residential zoning reform in Oregon. I have claimed zero credit, well, tiny bit of credit for this big change in 2019. Without the advocacy groups, the YIMBY groups, the Yes in My Backyard, it never would have happened. Never would have happened. And it's happening in the city of Portland. And those are the people who stood up toe to toe with their neighbor and said, I don't agree. I want more development. I want higher densities. This is what I support. We need to do this, including people from churches and so on. So that leadership comes from groups like Idaho Smart Growth and people like you. You would be amazed, and I've had to learn this late in life, one person being brave enough to articulate a position will reveal how many people agree. And that's often, you may think I'm the only one in the room who thinks this, and you may be surprised that it's not true. The other thing is, this is more about technique now. It's up to you to articulate the vision against which all the other plans and implement measures have to be chosen. You measure. There's a tendency in, not Idaho Smart Growth, but a tendency in NGOs to feel like they're the government and they have to bring in different points of view and compromise. No, that is the government. NGOs are advocates. You advocate effectively for what you think is necessary. And it's perfectly fine if you are never, ever satisfied. That was definitely my reputation. You are framing the debate. You are not the referee. You are a contestant. So as a planner thinking about this, instead of thinking about the headaches that people cause who come in advocating things, you need those. I think it was David Brower who said, activists are hell to live with, but they make great ancestors. Planners who are leaders are, it's very difficult because they often have elected officials and citizens pressing you from both sides. So your opportunity to lead is limited. I think Wendy, this is the situation she's in. There's limits to what she can do. So if you're not a process planner and you really believe in this stuff, you have to find who are the allies and how do you surface these decisions or these opportunities for elected officials. So I would say you can find a lot of things to read, but it's not a manual. It's politics. You'll have to learn that as well.
Thank you.
All right, I think we have just one other hand left up, which I think is perfect because we're just about at the end of our time here. So Cameron, go right ahead.
Thanks for the presentation, Robert. Similar question, I guess, to what you just got to with Jim and Rachel's questions, but curious specifically about urban growth boundary policy. Showed a couple of fantastic examples, from Oregon of the success of urban growth boundaries, on cities' growth through time. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to the codification and implementation of those boundaries in Oregon, and what Idaho's path might look like, especially in a place like Boise where those eggs have already been scrambled, if that's a reasonable path forward.
Well, Cameron, first of all, I want to note that of the examples you saw, there were some illustrations of success, but most of those examples of the city and country were not in Oregon. And they were in places where there was no requirement for urban growth boundaries. So in the case of California, they were done by citizen initiative at the county level, and then they become politically accepted and understood. And one other thing I'll say is that when you look at the first urban growth boundary was in Lexington, Kentucky. When I did those big reports, I looked at the places that had them. There's Frankenmuth and Sioux Falls. For years, when I talked to them, they said, please do not say urban growth boundary. That's an Oregon idea. It'll outrage everyone. And I looked at the latest update, and they were using urban growth boundary now. They didn't want to call it that. So what's in it? It's pretty simple. Is inside you have a line. By the way, when I was doing work in China, they kept asking questions about how you could see the line on the ground or on maps. And I was like baffled, like, what are you talking about? And the reason is all the planning information in China is secret. It's not public, so you don't actually, if there was a line, no one would know what it was. So that's why they're asking. It's a line on a map, inside city, outside country. And it's very simple, which is why it's effective. And then the implementation is you change the zoning inside and outside. It's really that simple, and infrastructure. Now, the sophisticated part, and it's gotten very elaborate in the Portland metro area because there's 23 cities inside that boundary, is a land need analysis. You can go online and look at this. And actually, if you're interested in it, go to Metro, the regional government, and look at the 2018 urban land or the land need analysis. It's now governed by state law. And what I find useful in that, it's hundreds of pages of analysis. But when you look at the parts of it, it's pretty obvious what's going on, like how much land gets redeveloped, where is it, what is the trigger for it, how can we forecast, what do we know about population, what do we know about demographics, what do we know about income, what do we know about jobs. And even though it's gotten to this pretty remarkable level of analysis and sophistication, if you just look at the sort of the framework, and the headline will give you a great idea about how you do that part of it. Because there are urban growth boundaries in Washington and in Oregon and in parts of California, there's now people who do this analysis professionally. You have to be careful about it, though. Tendency to add too much land. Now, about the scrambled eggs. Urban growth, every city in Oregon has an urban growth boundary. In fact, one of the cities has a smaller population than this webinar. It has an urban growth boundary. One of the things that happened in the beginning is they were too big. That was certainly true in Portland. Why? Politics, lack of sophistication, political pressure. And they were in the wrong place sometimes. But over time, you build out to it. So what we saw is infill and redevelopment on residential. It kept going up and up and up. And now we're at 60 to 70% now. So if you draw the boundary now with a bunch of the scrambled eggs in it, that's kind of frustrating. But if you stick to it, it's going to change. So I don't know if that was enough of an answer. There's tons written about this now. The best thing is to go look at Metro's website, find the urban growth report. It has a summary, and then you can go into the appendices. Actually are pretty amazing when you look at them. So that's the technical part. The political part is harder.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I will go ahead and wrap us up for tonight. Let me just start by saying a huge thank you to Robert for spending your time and sharing your talents with us this evening. And thank you to everyone who came. If you found wonderful nuggets in what you heard this evening, which no doubt you will want to go back and reference again, this session is recorded and we share it on our YouTube channel. It's something that you can go back and review and also share with people in your community and in your circles. So please feel free to do that. And you can subscribe and it'll notify you or whatever. And then also I have to, of course, share a pitch. Idaho Smart Growth is a nonprofit organization, and this series that we're putting on is funded through member donations. So if you find value in this program, please consider donating to our organization and supporting this program going forward. Our next session, Elaine, if you would pull up that slide that you shared at the beginning, I think it kicks it off perfectly. So our next session is going to be on April 7th. That's the first Wednesday in April. And if you see on Elaine's wonderful slide here that shows our smart growth principles, she's pulled it apart into comp planning and zoning. And so we'll welcome Aaron Qualls, who is a planner, lots of experience up in Sandpoint. And he's going to dig in a little bit more onto the idea of what is the difference between zoning and comprehensive planning. So if you're able to join us for that, please do and share with people who you think might be interested in hearing more about that.